The Admirals in One Piece are one of the series' most beloved groups of characters, and have been a trademark of the series since all the way back in episode 230 when Aokiji was introduced. You seriously cannot have a long discussion about One Piece without this drippy crew of characters appearing in your conversation, and recently I've been thinking a lot about this group of characters. Now, maybe that is because of the Admiral agenda that has been constantly in my YouTube Shorts comments, which has been a ton of fun despite how toxic it can sometimes get. I've actually been thinking about the Admirals from a different perspective. Recently, I can't help but find myself thinking, are the Admirals just done in One Piece? Now, before you start typing and telling me I'm ridiculous, I absolutely get it. I know that there's no way Oda is going to discard such an important group of characters, especially when the likes of Fujitora and Green Bull and even Akainu haven't gotten their story arcs in One Piece yet, so yes, the Admirals are not done yet. Rather, more so what I mean is, are the Admirals going to accomplish or fill the role that One Piece fans thought they would by the end of the story, or are things beginning to change? Unfortunately, I think one of the coolest groups of antagonists in One Piece, the Admirals, may have a far lesser impact than we thought going into the final saga of the story, and in this video I'm going to talk about what we thought the Admirals would be, what happened, and where they're going. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, I'd really appreciate it, and let's get into it. When Aokiji was first introduced right before Water 7, I immediately had pinned this group of characters, the Admirals, as a group of characters that would serve as an obstacle for Luffy's journey constantly as he rose throughout the pirate world. And actually, this ended up being a lot more true than a lot of people would give Oda credit for. Of course, you have the obvious cases like Kizaru in Sabaody Archipelago, the entire Admiral force in Marineford, but you also have Admirals appearing at conjunctures like Dressrosa and Fujitora, Green Bull and Wano, Kizaru again in Egghead Island. They really did end up fulfilling that role of an occasional obstacle that would go to stop Luffy on his rise to the top of the pirate world. And if that's what the role of the Admirals was supposed to be the entire time, then I think Oda did a fantastic job. However, for me and many other One Piece fans, I think the role of the Admiral was sort of shifted come Marineford. Marineford blew the cap off of One Piece, truly one of the most series-defining arcs in the entire story, not only because of the obvious stuff like Ace, Blackbeard, Whitebeard, but also because it set up the final war in such a grand way. And because of that, I think the Admirals were lumped into this group that would be the Final War's antagonists for a very long time. What really makes me think this is Whitebeard's speech at the end of Marineford. At this time in the story, yes, we had already been exposed to the world government, but the world government's weapon, the hand that they used to control the entire One Piece world, was the Marines. It was the Navy. We knew nothing more than that as far as the world government's reserve forces, which we'll get into later in this video. So when Whitebeard said someone would come along with the will of Roger and eventually Joy Boy, which we now know, turn the world upside down and engulf the world in a fantastic war, me and many other One Piece fans immediately pictured the enemy on the other side of that war, the people facing off against the Straw Hats, would be the Admirals, the Navy's greatest strength, because they directly serve the world government, the primary antagonist of One Piece. And this is exactly the moment for me that the purpose of the Admirals switched. Like I mentioned previously, if the Admirals were just supposed to be a very strong force, occasionally interrupting the Straw Hats, trying to catch them from their villainy, quote-unquote, then I think Oda did a great job. But because of Marineford, I think a lot of One Piece fans, myself included, expected the Admirals to be this all-encompassing end force, serving as a giant barricade for the Straw Hats to liberate the world, essentially being the final antagonist of the final war. But of course, as I'm sure you're all thinking as I'm talking in this video, that idea has no longer persisted because of the recent One Piece manga. It is no secret that the last 200 chapters has been Oda setting up a plethora of villains and strength-filled characters to serve as the opponents for the Straw Hats and the Straw Hat Grand Fleet in the final war. In Egghead Island we had the Seraphim, followed by the Gorosei, and in Elbaf we now have the Holy Knights, which we haven't even completely explored yet, but we already have insane additions like Shamrock, Shanks' twin brother, and Gunko, someone who's able to be possessed by Emu themselves. That's not even mentioning Emu themselves, and also the rest of the God Knights that haven't even been introduced yet, and also Figureland Garling, who just joined the Gorosei, who we haven't seen in action at all. This incredible display of power from the world government, not the Navy, the world government, really makes me feel like the Straw Hats will be facing off against the world government in the final war and not the Navy at all. Oda is spending so much time and resources building up these opponents for these Straw Hats to eventually liberate the world against, that it really makes me feel like the Admirals don't have a place left in the final war, or at least an organic place to have cool, fun matchups to try and stop these Straw Hats. The Navy's importance in One Piece has slowly whittled down after Kizaru's involvement in Egghead Island, and we've solely been focusing on these world government players, so I can't help but feel like this popular faction of One Piece characters, with such a dedicated fan base in the Admiral fans, is going to be a huge disappointment because of all the hype building up that's going to amount to nothing for these characters. The Admirals simply cannot fulfill the role we thought they would when Marineford came around, because they no longer have that build-up that they had during Marineford. They've been absent for a lot of the post-time skip, and the characters that have taken the spotlight now that Oda is building up to fulfill that role that we thought the Admirals would have is these members of the world government, the Gorosei and the Holy Knights. The Admirals no longer have that juice, that anticipation that the One Piece fans are waiting for across the world, because they aren't going to have an involvement that important in the final war, unfortunately. Now, I think a lot of people just heard exactly what I just said and are already typing a stormo in the comments, saying there's no way Oda would discard such a beloved group of characters that have such an important impact on the narrative. I agree with you, which brings me to the next part of this video. What can Oda do to bring back the relevance of the Admirals, make them important, and also make them serve a different role? A role that isn't the role we thought they'd play when Marineford aired. A role that fits a lot better into the final war, that doesn't clash with the purpose of these newly introduced characters like the Gorosei and the God's Knights. And I think that role that the Admirals are going to play in the final war is going to be something extremely unexpected, especially for all of these Admiral fans who are anticipating the Admirals taking on characters like the Yonko and showing their insane displays of strength. I actually think Oda has been very slowly building up the Admirals to separate from the world government and the Navy, creating a divide between the very top of the world with the world government and the hand that they use to rule over the One Piece world in the Navy. Again, I know that sounds crazy, but let's go one by one for all the Admirals left in the story, showing and explaining the evidence that Oda is in fact building a divide between these two factions of people. First, I just want to say I'm not going to be mentioning Kuzan. Yes, he was an admiral, but I think his importance in the story goes a lot deeper than the rest of the admirals because of his involvement with Blackbeard and his future involvement in the final war, which I'll be making a video about soon, so look forward to that. But first, let's start with the easy one with Fujitora. Fujitora, since the end of Dressrosa, or arguably even since the beginning of Dressrosa, has always been on Luffy's side. So there is absolutely no way that Fujitora was ever going to fulfill this role of an obstacle for Luffy in the final war, nor would he ever serve as an obstacle to Luffy anywhere in the story. He's always been a good-hearted guy on the side of the Straw Hats, and I think when the final war comes around, there is absolutely no way that Fujitora fights on the side of the world government. And of course, the next largest case of this was Kizaru's dilemma in Egghead Island. I know Kizaru's performance in Egghead Island is a bit controversial amongst One Piece fans because it wasn't exactly clear if Kizaru was going all out against Luffy or not, considering his relationship to Vegapunk. But what is easily spelled out for us One Piece fans is that Kizaru was not happy with the things he was forced to do on Egghead Island, which is shown to us through his phone call with Akainu at the end of the arc. I think after this phone call, it's very possible that Kizaru doesn't even make a return to the Navy, let alone the story, and he might be completely done with anything having to do with receiving orders from higher ups, which would totally make sense considering he had to kill his best friend. Now with Green Bull, it's a little tough because we have very little Green Bull screen time. However, in that little screen time, it becomes very clear that Green Bull is just an Akainu fanboy. And because of that, in order to determine what Green Bull's going to do in the end of the story, we can just look at what Akainu's going to do in the end of the story, because he will very likely be following Akainu. Now, I know this video has been about the substitution of the Admirals for the world government fighting forces, but Oda would not include Akainu in this legendary panel at the end of Egghead Island for no reason. Akainu absolutely is going to have a very important role in the end of the story, but again, probably something Akainu fans don't want to hear. I don't think he's going to be this big bad obstacle for characters like Luffy, Dragon, or Shanks, like a lot of his fans want him to be, because again, I think Oda is building up to some kind of divide here, where Akainu may even separate from the world government. Like I said, I know a lot of fans might be troubled by this because people are waiting for Akainu versus Luffy, or Akainu versus Sabo, or Akainu to just show a large amount of strength against one of our protagonists. But I'm sorry to say to all of those people, Oda has really been building up the fracture between Akainu and the world government for a very long time. From all the way back in the first days we saw him as the fleet admiral, he's constantly beefed with the world government on the orders he's supposed to enact. And even more convincingly, Oda gave us this big panel of Akainu during Vegapunk's speech, showing us that he's seemingly unhappy with the way the direction of the world is heading, and I truly believe there's no way Oda would make this very detailed panel with a very detailed facial expression if he wasn't hinting at some kind of disbelief or discontent in Akainu's heart. There is very clearly something building here across all of the Admirals. Oda has very discreetly planted these seeds for each of these characters to no longer fulfill the role we thought they would, which was the final villains of the final war, and instead he's building up something rather unexpected, for these characters to have a huge disconnect with the world government and eventually separate themselves from that entity. It would make sense considering all of the scenes that I've just shown. It would make sense for Oda to be building up all of these world government fighters if the Admirals aren't going to be present in the final war, and it would give a newfound purpose to this group of characters that were seemingly getting pushed to the sidelines in the name of building up characters like the Holy Knights and the Gorosei. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me here just because the Admiral fan base is gigantic, but I promise you, I love the Admirals. I think they're one of the coolest antagonistic groups in all of One Piece, and I really want them to have an important role in the final story. But I think it's important for us to just face the facts. The Admirals aren't the face of One Piece antagonists anymore. It's the world government, the Gorosei, and the Holy Knights, and if the Admirals want to have an important role in the end of the story, we're going to have to acknowledge these things and figure out where they're going to place in this final war. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is there any Admirals that are going to defect to the world government? Are the Admirals going to leave the world government like I mentioned in this video? Who's the strongest Admiral? Who's the weakest Admiral? I'll read any comment you have to leave about Admirals. Thanks for watching, and until next time.